Hey guys, Dr. G. Today we're going to be talking about managing individuals and a diverse workforce. Again, I'll leave it to you to go through the learning outcomes. The first point I want to make here is that diversity is different from affirmative action. And with affirmative action, I do want to also be clear on a couple of things because there's a lot of confusion surrounding what affirmative action is and what it isn't. Affirmative action refers to steps that an organization takes to create an internal workforce that matches the characteristics of the external labor market. It does not refer to quotas. A lot of times textbooks or the popular media or wherever will say that affirmative action is a quota and that if 20% of the relevant labor market is black, then you should have 20% of your workforce black. And that is not what affirmative action is at all. Affirmative action means that if 20% of your labor market is black and you currently have 10% of your your internal workforce being as black, then that means that you have to develop a timetable for achieving what the relevant labor market has. So if you're at 10% now, the idea is not let's fire a good number of your white employees and replace them with black employees tomorrow. The idea is let's look at what your normal turnover rate is, and given that, how long will it reasonably take us to get from 10% to 20%? So it's a goal and a timetable associated with that goal, and that's it. Nonetheless, affirmative action is oftentimes associated with diversity because obviously if you're meeting your affirmative action goals, then you probably do have a diverse workforce, but it is separate from diversity because diversity is a much broader concept encompassing things such as demographic differences, cultural differences, personal differences, etc. And that's separate also from inclusion, which is, okay, let's sort of take as a given that we have all these differences within our workplace. How do we make people feel like they can come to work being their whole selves? And that means that if you're gay, you don't have to pretend to be straight. That means if you're black, you can wear your hair naturally. That means if you're a woman and you're pregnant, you don't have to hide it from your supervisors or your coworkers, etc. So there are three separate constructs: diversity, inclusion, which is not on the slide, and affirmative action. The next slide just gives you a sense of where projected growth is in the US population. As you can see, the percentage that's white is expected to decline over time between now and 2060. Latinos or Hispanics are expected to grow at the highest rate of all of the major racial ethnic populations. Blacks are growing slightly, but not at a huge rate. Asians are growing. You can see the numbers of Asians are lower. That's what the bar is lower. But the increase, the slope of the graph is higher, meaning that they're growing at a higher rate. And Native Americans are, have, and always will be probably relatively flat. One of the reasons why organizations should strive for a diverse workforce is that it makes good business sense. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about some of the reasons or theoretical underpinnings for diversity. Generally speaking, organizations that are diverse tend to have lower turnover, less absenteeism. Obviously, they don't have to get mired in expensive lawsuits. Diverse organizations tend to attract a diverse pool of applicants. And there is a lot of research that suggests that minorities, for example, will look for organizations where there are more minorities represented, but specifically, not just that there are more minorities represented, but that there are minorities represented in positions of power. And in fact, one of my, a good friend of mine who does research in this area did in fact find that blacks are not really swayed by having other blacks represented in the company's advertising literature, but they are swayed by having blacks in the advertising literature where those blacks happen to be in positions, in managerial positions. It can also drive business growth, and it allows for higher quality problem solving in general because you get a broader set of perspectives if you have a diverse workforce. When we talk about diversity, there are different types of diversity. Generally speaking, In the research realm, we talk about diversity in terms of surface level characteristics versus deep level characteristics. Surface level characteristics are ones that you can fairly easily observe. So race, gender, age to some extent, and so forth. You can look at somebody and pretty well gauge those characteristics. Deep level diversity, on the other hand, has to do with differences that exist that aren't necessarily visible. Values, attitudes, beliefs. One area of research I'm particularly interested in right now is political affiliation, diversity or similarity, and how that impacts people's experiences or opportunities at work. Deep level diversity, and so getting people to switch from a focus on specifically surface level diversity to deep level diversity is one of the challenges that managers currently are facing. Because when we look at surface level diversity, we know that discrimination exists on the basis of surface level characteristics. To some extent, there is evidence that there is discrimination on the basis of deep level characteristics as well. So accountants may look down on HR people and so on and so forth. But those differences are much easier to integrate into business decisions and so forth in a much more effective way. So the focus is on moving from surface level diversity to deep level diversity, and that's really where, when we talk about more effective problem solving and things like that, a lot of that stems from deep level diversity. And the focus on, or one of the reasons to aim for moving from surface to deep level diversity is it allows for greater social integration. And by social integration, it's really sort of, feeling connected to your coworkers, feeling like your group is cohesive or your team is cohesive, etc. And although our focus is on diversity more than it is on discrimination, we can't really talk about diversity without really acknowledging the reality of discrimination. So in terms of age, age discrimination refers to treating people differently based on their age. In the legal context, age discrimination can only happen to older workers. So the law protects people who are above 40, but it does not protect people who are below 40, which means that legally an employer can say you're too young for this job, but they cannot say you're too old for this job. But nonetheless, age discrimination is an issue, and treating people differently on the basis of age, even if it is not illegal, is an issue. So it's important that managers recognize that age discrimination is more pervasive and problematic than they may realize, and to focus on making hiring and promotion decisions based on qualifications other than age. So, for example, it's not uncommon for managers to look at employees who are vying for a promotion and sort of rule out the older person, sort of thinking, well, they're not going to be here that long because they're likely to retire sooner, etc. And the reality is, they're probably not going to retire all that soon if they're active and interested in seeking a promotion. In addition, younger workers are more likely to turn over voluntarily, so in fact, the older worker may be more likely to stay at the organization. It's important also to keep an eye on the extent to which older people are receiving training in your organization. Oftentimes, because the stereotype exists that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, organizations are more reluctant to provide training to older employees. And it's important to make sure that older workers and younger workers interact with each other so that younger workers can see the value of the wisdom, I guess, that comes with age that older workers bring to the table, and older workers in turn can benefit from seeing what younger workers bring to the table in terms of new technology, so on and so forth. Sex discrimination occurs when people are treated differently on the basis of their sex. Some ways to sort of mitigate that are through mentoring programs. And in fact, there is a lot of evidence suggesting that women are either dissuaded from engaging in mentoring programs or are not given the same opportunities to get the same mentors that men are given. Also make sure that male-dominated social activities don't unintentionally exclude women. So if you're meeting for happy hour at a strip club, for example, that's going to exclude women. Or if you have a men-only golf outing or something like that, that's going to exclude women. And a lot of those social activities, in fact, are important for getting an inside track for promotions and so forth. In terms of women in top-level positions in organizations, you can see the blue represents 2013, the yellow represents 2008, the dark blue 2000, and the green 1995. Women have become a much higher percentage of top earners. In terms of corporate officers, they actually were growing for a while and then went down a little bit. Likewise, for being on boards of directors, they're currently only about 8% that are on boards of directors. And when any group is excluded or appears in small percentages in these key decision-making roles, the decisions that are made aren't going to reflect the needs of women employees at the organization, for example. And we see similar patterns with minorities as well, although the numbers are even smaller when you look at top earners, corporate officers, and boards of directors who are African American or Latino or Asian for that matter. When we talk about racial or ethnic discrimination, basically people are being treated differently on the basis of their race or ethnicity. It's important to get a sense of what the numbers look like. What are the hiring rates? What are the promotion rates? Get a sense of satisfaction. And I would say this is really key, this sense of satisfaction, because what we see is organizations have been doing a much better job in the last 20 or so years recruiting minorities. Where they're not doing such a good job is retaining them. So if you look at the voluntary turnover rates of minorities relative to whites, there's a huge difference. And so we call that the leaky pipeline. And that's actually one of my research interest areas right now is, well, what can we do now that we've gotten more minorities into the organization to make it more desirable for them to stay? Look at what criteria you're using for selecting and promoting people. Is there something that requires a lot of judgment, which would make it more open to biases, and make sure that those who are making hiring and personnel decisions have been trained in the importance of evaluating people objectively, evaluating people solely on the basis of job-related criteria. Disability discrimination has to do with people treating people differently on the basis of disabilities, and the disabilities can be physical disabilities, and those are usually more visible, or they can be mental disabilities. So somebody suffering from depression, you don't often know that they're suffering from depression, or somebody who has ADHD, or ADD, I should say ADD, because ADHD is a little more visible. But somebody who has ADD, for example, you may not realize what's going on in their head when they're processing all this information, but it nonetheless affects their ability to do their job. Managers should focus on becoming more educated, look at ways of accommodating the workplace to enable people with disabilities to perform their essential jobs, the essential tasks of their job, and help people, help find people, actively search out people who have disabilities who are qualified to do the job. I mentioned before, deep level diversity refers to disposition and personality. The book doesn't talk too much about deep level diversity, I should say, and attitudes. That's another one. We will talk a little bit about personality, I think, on the next slide. Although we think of personality as being an infinite number of characteristics, the reality is if you examine them statistically, it all boils down to 5, no matter what you call them. But basically it's extroversion, how much you make sense of the world externally versus internally, emotional stability, which basically refers to how much you vary. So some people have very high highs, very low lows. Some people have very little variance, so you can hardly tell when they're ecstatic versus when they're at rock bottom. agreeableness, which is kind of willingness to go along for the sake of the group, conscientiousness, the extent to which you go out of your way to do things carefully, and openness to new experience. We're about out of time now, so I'm going to end it there, but do watch the other video on diversity hats, and I'll see you next week.